Hello, everybody, and welcome to another issue of Comic Book Gentlemen. I'm your host, Greg, joined always by my co-host, Dave.
Hey, everybody.
Dave, we did an episode a while ago where we reviewed Avengers No Road Home. And
Hmm.
so after we did that, we're like, hey, this was pretty fun. You know, we both read a storyline and we talked about it. And then we were talking about other ideas for podcasts. And we mentioned, why don't we also talk about storylines where one of us has read it and the other one hasn't? And then that way
Yeah.
we can kind of get that type of perspective on stories. And so what we started doing was I made a list of comics that I've read and enjoyed, and then you made a
Hmm.
list of your comics you read and enjoyed, and then we kind of combined them to see like, oh, what have you read, what have you not read? And I was
Right.
genuinely surprised to find out that you haven't read The Watchmen.
No, no, I hadn't. I saw the movie, of course, when it came out, but outside of that, I was unfamiliar with the comic book version, or
Mm-hmm.
so I thought.
So I thought. For the people, I mean, obviously, and listeners who read comic books fairly regularly, you'll know The Watchmen because it's one of the most like historically talked about comic books I would say of all time. Like I feel like whenever you look up a list of like top 10 comic book storylines of all time, Watchmen is usually on the list. Or am I crazy?
Uh, Unfortunately, yes.
So that's why I was surprised to hear that you've never seen it. So what we're gonna do today is we're gonna talk about the Watchmen. We're gonna start with me because I'm probably similar to what most people experience the Watchmen with. Like I said, it's usually pretty popular. Most people have read it, so we'll start with me, and then we'll go into you, and we'll kind of talk about why you didn't read it when it first came out, and then we'll talk about like what you thought of it now reading it in 2020 as opposed to whatever freaking year it came out in 86 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Let's start with me. So The Watchmen for me, like I've said before in the past, I started reading comics when I was probably like 12, 13. I had a couple big influences on what I read. A lot of it was my friend Finnegan, but then also a lot of it was my dad. My dad, was a huge nerd when he was a teenager and whatnot, but he was one of those huge nerds where it wasn't like, oh, I read a comic every week. It was kind of like one of those like, oh, whatever the big storyline is, I want to check it out type of thing. So and he also grew up in the 80s, and of course the big thing in the 80s was like Frank Miller and all these dark comics is when it was when a lot of the darker comics started coming out. So
Hmm.
when I was about like 14 in grade 9 is when the Watchmen movie was announced by none other than Zack Snyder. Who did 300? So of course everybody was like, at least my dad and I were pretty excited because 300 was a pretty dope movie, and it was a comic
Hmm.
book adaptation. So we're like, oh, he'll do pretty well with Watchmen. But I didn't know what Watchmen was at the time. So my dad was like, yeah, you're 14. That's old enough to read Watchmen, which in hindsight, 100% not. But whatever. So he's like, yeah, check out Watchmen. The movie's coming out. Let's read it. So
It sounds to me like your dad was trying to not have all those conversations that you're supposed to have with your young adolescent kid, and just gave you the Watchmen as a nice summary of
yeah, instead of the
of
sex
what
talks, like here's a scene
what
of
life is
Doc.
like.
Here's a scene of Doctor Manhattan cloned like 15 times with one girl. That's the real
Yeah.
sex talk we all need. Yeah, it's one of those things where like we had a very weird relationship when it came to like M-rated stuff. Like I was watching like M-rated stuff and reading M-rated stuff when I was super like way too young. But it was just one
Hmm.
of those things where it's like, oh, he's mature enough, whatever. Here you go, buddy. Like it was like, oh, but looking back at it now, it's like, yeah, that's a little bit weird. But that's the past. We won't call the child services yet.
Hmm.
Anyways, he's like, check out the Watchmen. So at this point, like my main comic book influences, there weren't like, I mean, MCU was just starting. I watched Justice League and Batman animated adventures when I was a kid, and even that was a little bit dark for a kid,
Yeah.
because they dealt with some stuff. And then yeah, I read like Ultimate Universe. I read Ghost Rider, and then I was dabbling a little bit in 616 stuff like Civil War, and that type. And like I said, like I read a little bit of Frank Miller as well. And so like Watchmen was kind of like my first foray into like even more adult comics. And like not adult, like for I don't want people getting confused. I'm not saying this is like XXX, like it's nothing
No.
but
Yeah.
smut type of thing. Like it had that in there, but it wasn't like that's all it was type of thing.
No. No.
But like it was my foray into the thing, and I remember reading it. I mean, it's been a hot minute since I first read it. I mean, I'm 26 now, so it's been 12 years. But I remember, it was very influential on me. I remember, like in my 14-year-old brain, it was so edgy and cool. Like obviously, Rorschach was my favorite character because he's just so dark and brooding. And like I remember, like even if Doctor Manhattan, it was kind of weird seeing a giant blue dick on on every other page. At the time I was like, whatever. Like he's blowing people up. It's awesome, and it was so dark and gritty. And then I remember the movie came out, and so like I saw it obviously with my dad. And again, any scene that came up that was super awkward, we just didn't talk about. And then yeah, like I remember the movie. It wasn't terrible. It was just okay because it's one of those
Yeah.
things where it's like it got most of it right, but then it like left
Hmm.
out a couple details. It was like I would have preferred it the other way. It was like a 7 out of 10 movie type of thing.
Yeah.
But one of my like I have two embarrassing stories when it comes to Watchmen. The first was I convinced my homeroom teacher to read it, and because I
Okay.
was like I was like, oh yeah, Watchmen, and it's prolific and whatnot. So I convinced my homeroom teacher to read it, and then
Oh
he
boy.
read it and was like, oh, I didn't think it was that good. And my initial reaction was to throw a pen at my teacher. I literally had a pen in my hand and just launched it at him. And I was really lucky that he was a cool dude because he literally just laughed. That's all he did. He was like this idiot 14-year-old just threw a pen at me. And it's like, okay. And then my other embarrassing story was I was in youth group when Watchmen came out. And of course I was like obsessed or whatever about it. And my youth leader decided to film a video asking all the kids, like, what is Jesus to you? And
Mm.
like he was very open. Like the plan is to show this to the whole congregation. And for
Oh.
some reason in my head, I was like, you know who Jesus is? He's Doctor Manhattan.
Yeah. It could be.
So there's this video of me going on this like 5-minute explanation of how Doctor Manhattan is basically Jesus, including why he's naked. Like, of course Jesus would be naked,
Yeah.
type of thing. And like
Yeah.
this huge random explanation. And in my like looking about it back at it now, it's like the cringiest thing I've ever done in my life. Of like telling my youth leader all about this blue naked guy and like how it's basically Jesus. Oh, it was so bad.
I get the feeling that your parents might have got a phone call.
Oh no, you know what? I don't even think they're at the church at this point. I think the only people who are going to the church at this point was just me and my sister. So I don't know if they ever found out about it. Was the funny thing. So like yeah, I got away with a lot of crap. I mean, it wasn't even bad crap. It was just nerd
No.
crap.
No.
Was what
Yeah.
it was. So I remember Watchmen. Like I said, it was pretty influential. And then like I said, my dad was a very big influence. And what he would
Hmm.
always say is like the Watchmen changed the game. It was one of those books where it's like comic books were basically the same thing up until the 80s. Like it's all about pow and da 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 and like save the day and whatnot. But then the Watchmen came in and it was so gritty and dark and real and like it changed the comic book landscape. And that's why you suddenly got like Frank Miller coming in with Dark Knight and you got all these other writers coming in and giving these like dark, gritty, realistic superheroes and whatnot. And like that was one of the things that I was always like impressed on about Watchmen was how influential it was. I mean,
Hmm.
obviously I wasn't around in the 80s, so like it was one of those
Hmm.
things where I can never prove that because it was like, oh, I didn't know. So
Yeah.
like I just grew up thinking, yeah, Watchmen was one of those prolific moments in comic book history that influenced comic books forever. And so like I remember so yeah, that happened and then I even started reading Alan Moore more because I was like, oh, I liked Watchmen. Let's start reading his other stuff. And I don't know, have you ever read anything else by Alan Moore?
Some of the Captain Britain stuff.
Okay, yeah, I didn't
Yeah.
read that. What I read was like Killing Joke,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
is
Read that
another
as
really
well.
famous book by him about Batman and the Joker. And then I read
Yeah.
League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And
Hmm.
so what I started to find out about Alan Moore is most of his books have really interesting concepts, but then he
Mhm.
like takes a bunch of acid halfway through, and like most of his books just like go completely off the rails and like make no sense. Like Killing Joke's a little bit more reined in because it was obviously
Mhm.
DC in charge and was like, no, 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 like you can go crazy, but don't go too crazy. But like
Yeah.
League of Extraordinary Gentlemen was just like it just it hit that point where it just he just went nuts and anything was okay with him and it was really
Yeah.
weird. And like the other thing I started realizing is like he had certain tropes and whatnot that he used a lot. Like he only ever had like one female character and like they something sexual would always happen to them. They were either raped or assaulted or something like that. And it's just like okay, that's nice, I guess. And like there's always death and there's always other stuff. So it's like one of those things where it's like but I still always held in my heart that like but Watchmen was game changing and all that stuff. So and
Yeah.
I can't remember the last time I read it. But yeah, it's been a while. But that's kind of my experience with Watchmen. And I'm assuming there's probably other people out there like me. There are probably more there's probably some people who were actually in the '80s when this happened. And were like, oh, look at Watchmen, and it was so prolific and whatnot. So I'm curious to see now. So
Mhm.
you just read it. You just
Yeah.
finished it, apparently.
Yeah.
Uh, so what's your opinion on Watchmen? After it's been decades since it came out, and you were live when it first came out, but you didn't read it until now. What's your opinion on Watchmen?
I would start by saying it kind of falls into two categories. So the first would be reading it right now and experiencing it right now. It was kind of like blah. It really was not, this Hugo Award-winning book that I was expecting. Now, part of that might have been because it was partially spoiled by the movie
Mhm.
because I've already seen the movie. I'm pretty sure as I was reading through it, I must have stumbled across two or three issues in the middle of it or something because it got real familiar,
Mhm.
and it was nothing to do with the movie. But at the end of the day, it was, for all that it's hyped up to be, uh, I've kind of felt like, yeah, like for today, this isn't anything new.
Mhm.
This is nothing new. This is a lot of stuff that you're now seeing, whether it's on TV with the boys or just in comic books in general. As far as groundbreaking, if somebody like myself was kind of reintroduced to this today and read it, it's not all that shocking. It's not all that groundbreaking because I think you see a lot of this in comics nowadays, and maybe not a lot of the mainstream comics like your DC and stuff, which you do, but certainly within other graphic novels.
Mhm.
So from that perspective, I was kind of like, like it was a read. Um, I do think back and go, okay, well, what if I was reading this in the '80s? Um, Certainly, I wouldn't have been reading it in the '80s because I don't think my parents would have let me. But I can say that in the '80s, what would have turned me off, number one, would have been number one the art. Wasn't a big fan of the art, but I think that the crux of the Watchmen is not so much about the art; it's about the story.
Mhm.
So if you bypass that and you just get to the story, there were a couple aspects that I took out of it and go, okay, I can see where this was put out there. And not that other comic books didn't tackle these kinds of subject matter. Like I do remember a very good story arc in Amazing Spider-Man when Harry Osborn became addicted to drugs, right? And there was a whole arc there about him struggling with drugs and going through this stuff. Now, Watchmen and Alan Moore certainly like grabbed that and went like way over the line with it. But certainly there were aspects of that there, just not to the degree that Alan Moore tackled it, and to the depth that he tackled it. So I think for myself, I can see where this came out. People read it and went, "Wow, this is real life. This is what things would look like if superheroes actually existed. These are the things that you would see." I could see where this could be credited for a definite shift in where comic books went and where they are today. So I can give it that credit. But there were just story elements and ideas there that I have a hard time quantifying it as like a traditional, not a traditional. I have a hard time even quantifying it as a superhero graphic novel.
Interesting. So, like, what do you think separates it from being a superhero graphic novel? Like, what would you categorize it as?
I would categorize it as certainly just a graphic novel.
Okay, but not like a
So,
superhero one.
but not a superhero one. Even though there's an element of obviously superheroes there,
Hmm.
I would have a hard time quantifying this as a superhero book.
Mm. So I have two questions.
Hmm.
One, you said like your parents probably wouldn't have let you read it. Were
Yeah.
your parents really like hands-on when it came to what you read as a kid?
No, I think it would have been more of a fact that I probably would have got it, read it, pointed out some of the content that was in it at some point, and then I could see my mother saying, I don't know if you should be reading this. My dad would be probably like, I read worse stuff. So it probably would have been, depending on what age, it may have been pulled away from me, but at the same time, I mean, we were watching, at the time, I remember when I was quite young, when RoboCop, the first RoboCop came
Mm.
out, extremely violent
Yeah.
for its time. And we watched that at my birthday. I can't even remember what birthday that was. And we were only in our early teens. So yeah, maybe my parents would have taken it, maybe not. At the same time, I think both my parents would have been just happy I was reading something and not getting into trouble.
Yeah.
So, but I just for me it was just it was something that I think my parents definitely would have questioned why I was reading it.
Yeah. Like, what's the appeal? Yeah.
Yeah, at the age I would have been at when this came out.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like sometimes you can say that a lot about comics, where it's like, are you reading
Yep.
it for the story or for the, art, type of thing? Especially when you
Yeah.
look at some of the ways they've
Pictures.
drawn certain characters, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
it's a little iffy. But I've actually, side note, I actually
Yeah.
had recently one of my sisters-in-law ask me like, oh, can you recommend some comics for my sons? But they're like 6 and 9, and it's just
Mm.
like, I don't know if I can. Like,
Yeah.
I'm sure they have comics for kids, but yeah, there's definitely a lot more that's like teen and up is what I find most comics are. And yeah, and then you have the Watchmen, where it's definitely not teen.
No.
Like I should not have been reading it when I was that young. But so my another question I have for you,
Yeah.
I have more, but like my next question I have for you is, what's your opinion on superhero deconstructism?
Superhero. Ugh.
Deconstruction.
I guess what are like what makes a superhero?
Yeah, basically. So, like, for those of you
Yeah.
who don't know, basically what superhero deconstruction is basically like, you know, superheroes, like I said, back in like the 60s and 70s were all about like, oh, these are the best of humanity, and these were like, supposed to be the
Yeah.
best of the best type of thing, and this is what people should be aiming for.
Yeah.
And then superhero deconstruction is all
I,
about
I,
taking those ideals and trying to boil them down. If this was real life, there's no way these would actually like be realistic at all. And then it
yeah.
kind of applies it to real life, and then either shows it in a better light of how like a real person could live up to superhero morals, or it just turns it super dark and like everybody dies type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is where I struggled with it the most.
Mm.
Because I felt like, and I struggled with it so much that I was like, I need to go research and take a look at some like who is Alan Moore and why is he so dark?
Yeah. Why is he the way
So
he is?
I did a little bit of research on that. You weren't far off with the acid.
Yeah.
It was LSD that was his preferred drug. Um, I feel like what he did was he kind of went, this was the impression I got. I hate superheroes.
Hmm.
I'm gonna take superheroes, and I'm gonna have superheroes that represent. I mean, it's not too far fetched to look at some of the superheroes that are on the team of the Watchmen and kind of compare them or bang them off and compare them or say, okay, this is representative of Batman. This is representative of whoever. So he has this group of superheroes, and then he builds these, and I'll give him credit, very deep and sophisticated flaws
Hmm.
with all of these people, all of them. So, okay, so they're not Superman, they're not the Boy Scout that always does everything right and never does anything wrong, and they're more human. But I feel like then he just goes, yeah, they're human. These experiences define them. They're super flawed people, and they're never going to learn from it.
Yeah. Like I said, the
So
darker timeline.
yeah, so you went, oh, okay, I can get it. Okay, you're gonna, these people have some flaws. Part of being, and this is where the superhero aspect comes in. Part of being a superhero to me, or a hero of any type, is you can have flaws. You can be an incredibly flawed person, but at some point you overcome that.
Hmm.
And these people don't through the entire thing.
Yeah.
I was just waiting to see, okay, somebody give me something. It was just incredibly dark, and it was painting a picture of like, oh, if superheroes were real, this is kind of what they would be like. And now I can kind of see where the boys, the TV series The Boys, getting their thing from. Is like, it's just like, let's just turn the horrible notch all the way up.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, I just felt like there was no win. Like, I got to the end of it and I was just like, well, that was a thing. I can't decide if I feel worse from worse about how I feel about it at the beginning or the end.
Yeah.
It just kind of felt like it happened, and that was it. So I felt like, did he expose elements that now you see just all through comic books and superheroes in general? Yes, and I think it was he did this in a way that made everybody go, oh, you can get away with that. So let's start putting that in comic books, because we won't go as far as Alan Moore, because we don't want to ostracize everybody, but certainly we can push the limits.
Yeah.
And whereas he just went, there are no limits.
Yeah.
I'm just going to push it as far as I want.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me then that, like, it's not even just like the Watchmen is well known, like you said earlier, like it actually has won awards for being such a like big comic book. So when you were younger and this first came out, did you hear about it a lot, or was it talked about a lot,
No.
or was it one of the things that never came up to Fort St. John?
No, it was like I do remember hearing of the Watchmen. I do remember it being tied to DC in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
But for the most part, like, it wasn't something that I remember going into the local comic book store and seeing sitting on the shelf.
Mm. Yeah.
It was something that I would say older comic book readers read and whispered and talked about in dark corners of the comic book store.
Yeah.
Because it just wasn't. It was not. I'm going to say it just wasn't mainstream.
Mm. That's interesting. Like, it's crazy to me to hear this now, because like DC has made a point of trying to make it like so mainstream.
Oh yeah.
Like at one point, like Dr. Manhattan was the reason why the New 52 happened or some crap like that. Like, I feel like what happened was DC went, okay, we're kind of failing here because you have the MCU and whatnot. What's our top IPs of all time? Oh, wait, what's this Watchmen thing? Let's shove this in everything.
Yeah, I went down that little bit of a rabbit hole as well, a little bit, just to get an understanding of the longevity of it, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think what Alan Moore wrote here is incredibly, it's deep. There's many facets to it. You get to the end and it's not really resolved, and it kind of leaves you on an edge, and I liked that aspect of it. It was just kind of left you going, okay, did the world turn into this kind of utopia type place that what's his name, Osmond is? Yeah, was trying to create. Is that what happened? Did the owl go off with his now new mistress and have a wonderful like it kind of left you at that stage, and I know they've hinted towards it now, especially with the the doomsday clock and stuff as to kind of what happened.
Hmm.
But just I could imagine just reading this at the time and being left with this like, oh, okay, now it's up to me as the reader to kind of guess or imagine what happened to these people.
Hmm. Like
which
extrapolate.
which was interesting. It tackled some very interesting concepts, which I don't think as as an average everyday person, you can look at, what the I'm going to throw in air quotes here, the bad guy was trying to accomplish, and how he went about it by murdering, hundreds of thousands of people, to try and push society towards a more of a kind of utopia kind of thing in his vision. You could look at that, any person would look at that and go, oh my God, what a horrible person. But on the grander scheme of things, like the way he painted it, you could kind of see where he was coming from.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that Thanos thing that you had in Endgame and Infinity War, right?
Mhm.
There's only so many resources. We gotta cut down on the people. That's a horrible idea. On the grand scope of things, is it?
Yeah. This episode of Comic Book Gentleman is brought to you by Chess, but way cooler. If you enjoy the game of chess but want to mix it up again, why not try Chess, but way cooler? Purchase your order of the game, go to ChessersSky.com to find out more.
So, some of the concepts that he drew on were really deep, really interesting, especially, and I had to keep taking myself and go, okay, don't think about it now in 2020. How would I have received this in 1980?
Yeah.
In the 80s. I can see where those concepts were just people were just like, just blew their mind.
Hmm.
100%.
Yeah. I like looking back at it now. I like to liken it to the original Star Wars trilogy,
Mm-hmm.
because like I watched the original Star Wars trilogy when I was probably like 15, or like I think I watched it after I watched the prequel trilogy,
Right.
just because like the way it timed out and whatnot. I didn't watch it till later. And like I remember, like obviously it's Star Wars. Everybody hypes it up
Mm-hmm.
to no end. They're like, it's freaking Star Wars, man. It's the greatest movies series of all time. You gotta watch. You gotta love it, type of thing. And I remember
Mm-hmm.
watching it like when I was like first watch it. Man, it's boring. Like watching the original trilogy when you're 15, you're used to like backflipping Yoda and
Yeah.
like like crazy clone armies fighting and whatnot. It's so hard to go back and watch that. But then you start thinking about like you talk to people who watched it when it first came out, and you talk to people who've loved it for such a long time. You start realizing a lot of the times you have to appreciate it for what it did for the industry almost.
Yeah.
Because like there's so like especially for Star Wars, there's so many like special effects that it implemented, and like the way it influenced blockbusters and whatnot, like in nerddom in general. It's
Mm-hmm.
massive. Like even if the product nowadays would be considered boring in comparison, you almost have to appreciate it for what it did to the industry. And I feel like that's something you can kind of do with Watchmen. Maybe not 100% the same way, but I feel like I said, like now, like you said, you see that type of stuff a lot more in comic books. You have The Boys, you have like a Dark Knight Returns, which came out around the same time, but still
Yeah.
pretty influential. You have there's a bunch of manga and anime that talk about this type of stuff now too. And it's one of those
Mm-hmm.
things where it's like even if the original material is pretty boring in today's standards, there's just so much that it did and groundbreaking it did that kind of led the comic book industry to where it was, for better or for worse, that I feel like you almost have to just appreciate. At least that's my opinion. I don't know if that's something you share reading it nowadays.
Yeah. No, I mean, just from as a piece of literature, which I have to say it is that, because the art was god awful. Sorry, Mr. Dave Gibbons, but that was really bad art. Just the writing, like again, the depth of which like each character is. There's a depth to the character. There's just some very interesting flaws. Like it was just the way that it was written, alone. Like it was a great piece, of work by Alan Moore. But I just, where I struggle with it is if somebody just gave this to me and said, hey, it's a graphic novel, yeah, it's kind of got the concepts of superheroes, but it's not really about that. It's just give it a read. I think I would have approached this a lot differently, but because I've always seen it and heard of it as a pitch, which I'm sure Alan Moore would be like, no, this was not a superhero book at all.
Yeah.
If anything, it was an ode to his disdain for superheroes. I think at the end of the day, when I read through it, if you eliminate all that stuff, it's an interesting story, and especially for, again, if you go back to the 80s, even if you read it in the 90s, interesting, really interesting. But I think a lot of these subjects that he covered have now been kind of refurbished and reused and rehashed, that it doesn't have the same impact now as it definitely probably did, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, no, I can see that. Like you said, like even like I said about Star Wars, like back in the day, I'm sure that was top notch, graphics and effects and whatnot. But then like you compare it to like nowadays, and it's like, oh, it's just a toy with a string on it, type of thing.
Yeah.
You see like, where's the CG and where's all the cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think. Yeah, Watchmen is definitely interesting looking back at it. I will fight you a little bit on the art. In my opinion, like I'll agree. I don't think it's like the greatest art I've ever seen. But to me, it's like quintessential 80s art, because I feel like a lot of 80s stuff was similar to this, where it was very much like, the characters were very detailed and whatnot, but then like the background stuff is usually very like, who cares? But again, I haven't read it in a long time, so maybe I'm forgetting how bad it was. But that's what I always think of 80s art, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, like I said, it was. I mean, I typically don't pay it. I mean, art when it comes to a graphic novel or a comic book itself, I think a lot of people get hung up on that. They'll go, "Oh my God, well, the whole point of picking up a comic book is because there's art in it. If I wanted to read a novel, I'd get a novel." But at the end of the day, I think what the art did do is that it did its job. As far as what it needed to do, which was help tell the story, but it wasn't anything like, nobody was picking this up and going, "Oh my God, I have to get this. Look at the art."
Yeah.
Nobody was doing that. And there are a lot of comic books that are sold that way now. I mean, you see a lot of top-notch comic book artists that just do covers now, so that they get you into the cover. Oh, look, the cover looks so great. Oh, this is going to be awesome. Then you get inside with some other completely different artist that's nowhere near as talented.
Yeah.
They do that all the time. But again, that I think is missing the point of this. If you're reading The Watchmen because you're thinking, okay, I'm going to see this, I'm going to see a comic book, you are sadly mistaken. if you're going in going, I hate to read. So that's why I'm reading a comic book, because it's kind of like a 50-50 trade-off, maybe a little more off-center, where I get to actually just see it and then not read as much. No, because there's a lot of dialogue in this. I would hate to see something written by him and Bendis at the same time.
Yeah.
That would be just absolutely god awful.
There wouldn't be any
room
pictures.
for art.
There wouldn't be any pictures.
Yeah, but again, like if you go back to what he was attempting to do, what he did do, the tones, the subject matter. I mean, a lot of the stuff that he covered off was I can't imagine how somebody was reading that the first time and they were hearing about the comedian trying to rape one of his teammates, and then how she's reacting as an older lady saying, "Yeah, it was a big deal. I choose not to think about the bad stuff.
Yeah.
It seems inconsequential." That somebody reading that would be just like offended to some degree. And then the same thing with Rorschach, where he's kind of like, I like the comedian because what he did here, because he's very black and white. And they're like, well, yeah, but he did this. Yeah, but she was a hooker. So I don't care. I can imagine so many points through this, especially in the 80s and 90s, somebody would be reading through this and go, "Oh my God, I am so offended."
Hmm.
by what is being said here and what is being communicated here. But that's where I would say Alan Moore saw the line, erased the line, and then just went as far as he felt like going on whatever subject matter he chose to tackle. And there's a lot of different, like each character kind of carries their own weighty kind of moral story.
Hmm.
Some deeper than others,
Yeah.
but it was just, from that aspect, I can say like, wow, what a terrific, piece of work.
Hmm.
Like he really did his work here. It wasn't as simple as, like I'm just a superhero because I'm a superhero and I do all the right things. That's not what he went for. He was like, why did they do what they do? Okay, now that I got the why, how would a real life person nowadays act on that why?
Yeah.
And I think that's the real kind of treasure buried in there. And again, I could see when this came out, I can imagine other writers just started salivating because they were like, "Oh my God, I'm free. I can now, explore
Yeah.
the ether of those things that just were never covered off in a comic book."
Yeah. Like it feels like that happens a lot in a lot of mediums where it's like, oh, one thing gets popular and it includes something that what used to be taboo, but because it's popular and it gets away with it, then everybody just feels like
Yeah,
they can throw that taboo thing into everything and it'll be okay. Like I feel like
yeah,
that's what happened a lot with Game of Thrones when it came to nudity and sexual content, was that Game
yeah,
of Thrones is popular and it was popular because of, the political intrigue and the character development and whatnot. But then because it
mhm,
had the nudity and whatnot, everybody went, "Oh, that's what people like. Let's shove that in everything."
yeah. No,
Like,
I mean it's. I think you definitely hit a very strong point. This was like at the time, you could go through this and you could go, okay, these are things that maybe got talked about in private, um, or ideas that were shared between very few people, but for this to get published into a comic book series, and again I use that in quotations, this graphic novel, it just like ballsy,
mhm.
number one, like wow, that they would go that far. Um, but to your point, I think a lot of people took a look at this and they didn't really understand what the Watchmen was,
Yeah,
and then to your point, just said, "Oh, nudity's okay. Okay, let's do nudity.
yeah,
Oh, violence is okay. Let's just do violence. Oh, we already do violence. Oh, but it's okay to go really graphic with the violence. Oh, okay."
yeah,
And that's what they did without really understanding what he was actually accomplishing or,
yeah.
or trying to do with this.
Yeah, and I feel like that even speaks a lot to like why people like certain aspects of the graphic novel. Because like I said earlier, when I was 14, I loved Rorschach. I thought he was a
Yeah,
great character. I thought he was super cool. Look at that sick mask. Look at him beat the crap out of
yeah,
everybody. But then what you're
hmm,
supposed to really realize when you're reading it is no, Rorschach's a sad story. You're supposed to feel
oh
bad
yeah,
for him and what he's doing is wrong. But like at the time when
yeah,
I was 14, I was like, heck no. You go
yeah.
murder those people, Rorschach. That's great.
And he's so black and white in
Hmm.
his approach to life. And again, there's so many connections. Like a Rorschach test is typically black and white, and it's ink blots. And what is it? What do you see? He sees everything in black and white. And like at the very end, like you can see where if the plan actually matured and moved forward, and the world became this place that was the intent of the, again, the supervillain. He couldn't live in that world.
No,
There's just no way.
no.
He couldn't live in that black and like he's so black and white.
Yeah. You couldn't live in that gray world.
No,
Yeah.
and it was like there were just so many little nuances that I thought were really really well done,
Hmm.
um, from an aspect of like, again, when this was written, you never would have seen this in a Superman comic.
No,
You never would have
no.
seen this in a Spider-Man comic.
Yeah.
Even though they tackled some of that, stuff a little bit here and there, not to the degree. And it wasn't just like I find The Boys. The Boys is just pure shock value.
Yeah.
Like, let's see how many heads we can see blow up. You know, whereas there was a purpose to what you were seeing and what you were being exposed to in this book.
Yeah.
And again, to your earlier point, I think that's where, you know, unfortunately, some people maybe mistook it as, you know, things moved on into the 90s and the 2000s and to today, where it was just like, well, the Watchmen did this, so, you know, we'll do it, without understanding what the actual purpose of that was.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I definitely think it's one of those things where it's like you have to the idea of the Watchmen is interesting and depth and whatnot. It's just the execution might not have been perfect, and the interpretation later might not have been perfect for the work.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, as far as a literary piece of work, it's you know it's definitely a good read, because it really, like, if you're willing to just park all of your you know, all of your immediate thoughts, or just take it for what it is, and just try to understand what he was trying to convey in his LSD mind when he was writing this, or whatever he was doing. You can understand, like, it's a very deep, well thought out idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I think people either will look at it and go, oh, okay, this is okay, let's just keep doing this, or people would just read it and get highly offended and then never touch it again.
Yeah. And like I said, Alan Moore kind of has this issue when you read a lot of his stuff, where you know, the concept is really interesting and thought out, but then the execution is usually where he fumbles the ball a lot, either because he just, you know, doesn't care, or because he just takes a bunch of acid and shit happens.
I do have to say, like, I mean, you know, just doing a little bit of research into Alan Moore, like, that was the thing I found interesting. Like, he went on a heck of a little diatribe about how he thinks the concept of superheroes and superhero movies, and this is like, or this racist yada yada yada. Like, he went on and he went off on the entire industry. As to what he thought his, you know, the thoughts are. So, you know, when somebody comes to me and says, "Oh man, Watchmen, great comic book," I go, can a guy who hates comic books or superheroes that much write a superhero comic? No, I don't think he can. I think he wrote a very intriguing story that just happened to be around superheroes. There really weren't a lot of, you know, epic fights, or, you know, the good guys overcoming the bad guys. In fact, at the end of the day, they kind of lost.
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody lost.
Like, Ozymandias pretty much won, is the moral of the story.
So, you know, at the end of the day, it's missing so many, and I imagine that was his intent as well. It was missing so many of the tropes of what we now see as a superhero thing. You know, anything to do with superhero. It doesn't matter how badly you beat them down. Eventually, I'm going to get to a comic book issue, or I'll get to an episode in the series, or I'll get to the end of the movie, and the good guy will win.
Yeah. And yeah, that doesn't happen in The Watchmen.
No.
Yeah.
No.
So the interesting thing is, like, The Watchmen technically has continued on. Have you heard or seen anything about the HBO series?
Yeah, we watched probably the first, I think it was 3, 4, maybe up to 5 episodes, if I got that far. And there was just, at the time, like, outside of some of the links with Rorschach and some of the other characters, there wasn't enough going on there to really get me hooked and interested, so we just kind of dropped off. But I did hear that, you know, towards definitely the second half of the season, that it got a lot better and actually brought in to focus a lot more connections to the actual characters.
Yeah.
From the graphic novel. So I don't know if I'll ever pick that back up and take a look at it, because it just, at the end of the day, and again, you know, somebody might read this and go, "Oh, I love these characters, they're so awesome, and, you know, I love the depth and everything." Yeah, okay, that's your thing. To me, the characters from a story level were not, like, intriguing. Well, they were intriguing, but they weren't interesting to me. Like, I just wasn't there was nothing that grabbed me, and I went, oh god, I gotta read more about the owl, or any of these characters.
Yeah.
The story was great. Like the overarching story and idea was fantastic. The depth was good. I just felt like, especially if you have a hard time with dark material, don't read this, because you're not going to get to the end and go, oh, everything's okay. Because you go character by character, and you're going, well, that sucks.
Yep.
And that's it. You're just left holding the bag.
Yeah.
But for me, that's it. Just was not something that when I saw the HBO series come out, that I was like, oh my god, I'm such a huge fan of the Watchmen, I got to watch this. It just didn't appeal to me. That's all. It appeals to other people, doesn't mean I'm right. It just didn't appeal to me.
Yeah, I haven't watched it. I've heard a lot of good things about it. Basically, what I've heard was like, it does carry on the story, and it kind of, it brings up a lot of issues that kind of go along with what Alan Moore was talking about. Like, it wasn't just, they didn't just turn it into like, like superhero type of thing. They kind of still talked about, they talked more about race, and they talked more injustices in America and whatnot, and like develop from there.
Yeah.
So I've heard good things about it. Do you think now that you've read the graphic novel, you do want to go back and try to watch the show, or you're kind of like, no, I'm good?
No, I actually I'm pretty much in the same spot I was, before reading through it. I just don't have a lot of interest in it. It's just,
okay.
I guess maybe, I hear a lot of people that have read this, and I'm sure if I went up to them and said, yeah, I'm not really interested, they'd be like, oh my god, what kind of comic book reader are you? You don't know what you're talking about. And you occasionally find people that are like that when you come across and somebody says, oh, I've never watched a Star Wars movie. What? You're out of your mind. Or Lord of the Rings, what's that? What? You'll occasionally come across these people. I'm just one of those people that just, I read it. I can give it its due in some of the areas that I thought he did a really good job of.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of that, I just don't have a lot of interest in it.
Yeah.
Like, for me, it's the suspension of belief. Like with Spider-Man, like, yes, is he a flawed character? Yeah, there's some flaws there. Are they as deep and ugly as the stuff in the Watchmen? No. But at the end of the day, it's an escapism, and even though they're going down that road of, having kind of a little more mature aspect to it at times, it's still not any. You're going to come out at the end and go, Spider-Man's a good guy.
Yeah.
He saved the day in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. I can just move on with my life. If I was reading The Watchmen as a series, day in and day out, I don't know what kind of a headspace that would be in.
Yeah.
Because it's very dark, and I just don't see the appeal of somebody going like, oh yeah, I want to keep reading about these characters that never get over their flaws, that don't really demonstrate the attributes of a hero.
Yeah.
Beating up people is not a hero.
Yeah. I think my only counter argument to that is I feel like I agree that, the nice thing about reading stories and escapism and whatnot is like, them overcoming their flaws. But what it feels like a lot of the times is that some of these superhero comics have been around for so long, there's not a lot of flaws for them to get over anymore. Like Spider-Man, I don't know what other flaws he has. He's kind of been through the ringer.
No, he just he goes from broke to broker.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
That's his thing.
He goes from 5 girlfriends to 4 girlfriends.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. Yes. A lot of these, and I think that's where the graphic novel aspect of this really works, because it's just a one-hit, boom, done, right? You're finished. Even though DC is trying to stretch the hell out of this, and it was quite interesting to hear Alan Moore's comments on his literary works being transformed into some other media, like movies, and his complete aversion to it, and he hates it so much. I have an interesting, it'd be interesting just to sit down with him, because I don't think he would find he likes a lot of things.
No, he doesn't. He's a very grumpy old British man.
Yeah. So he's a very strange individual, but I mean, his writing and his approach certainly unique. And I could say if you've got the time to read The Watchmen, you want to again just get into the point that he was trying to make with this. It's worth the read in that aspect. But if you're reading it for entertainment from a traditional superhero aspect, don't touch this
No.
at all.
Yeah. And I think let's stop putting it on the top 10 comic books of all time because it's a good graphic novel, but it's not a superhero story. I think is what we kind of established here.
Yeah, that's where I would establish. If you said top 10 graphic novels, sure, because there's a lot of things that are not superhero based that are graphic novels that are great graphic novels. 300 was a graphic novel.
Yeah.
Great graphic novel. It's not a superhero.
No.
It's not a superhero genre type thing. This, even though it has elements of superheroes, I don't think to me, that's not the point.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. So yeah, this was our discussion about The Watchmen. A very, like I said, very prolific book that I was curious to see what Dave's opinion was on it. Let us know what your opinion is on it in the comment section. You can find us, wherever you found us, keep following us. You can also find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, YouTube, all that good stuff. So yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
You betcha. Stay safe. Be good.